خوش آمدین هموطن گرامی. من شهریار افشار هستم از Politics 365. امروز مجدداً یکی از صاحب نظرهای فعال امور دولتی و سیاسی رو دعوت کردیم به برنامه‌مون، آقای دکتر اریک لاب از فلوریدا اینترنشنال یونیورسیتی. آقای لاب چند بار در برنامه شرکت کرده و کارشناس واقعا تمام موضوع سیاسی خاورمیانه به علاوه ایران. بقیه برنامه به انگلیسی تهیه شده. میخواستم فقط آقای لابو معرفی کنم و به برنامه‌مون ادامه بدیم. Eric Lob, welcome back to Politics 365. So much has happened since we last talked. Unfortunate, tragic, shocking events in Israel and Gaza. I think it's caused a lot of confusion with the Iranian community, at least worldwide. Of course, any human being would be shocked by the events of October 7, but then any human being would be equally shocked and hurt by the events happening in Gaza in the ensuing weeks. Iran, as a policy issue, it seems like it's fallen now third, fourth in line after Ukraine, after Gaza. Meanwhile, what's going on in Iran is no less important and no less vital to the future of the Middle East and Iran and U.S.-Iran relations and the Iranian community. So we wanted to ask you back and kind of check in with you on how you see events unfolding in Gaza. What are the implications and the rippling effects, either with Iran's relationship with Hamas or eventually U.S. relationship with Iran? Even I've talked with others about the power brokerage that Qatar has played. You know, tiny Qatar, most Americans could not put Qatar on a map, and yet they have become the singular power broker to at least buy some time in the recent ceasefire. So give us your initial reactions of kind of an update of what you see unfolding and its effects on Iran and the U.S.-Iran relationship, and we'll go from there.
Okay, well, thanks for having me back. And as you said, a lot has changed so quickly and in unfortunately in very, very negative ways. It's just hard to digest and process the footage that we're seeing. I mean, you know, like you said, from the attack on October 7th, that took so many people by surprise, the atrocity that was committed, and then the follow-up to that, the attacks, the response by Israel, and you know, sitting here today, the death count, because the truce has fallen apart, the temporary truce and the hostage and prisoner exchanges and humanitarian aid flows, and now we're back to conflict just 6 days later. You know, there's families dying as we speak in Gaza, and you know, we're at a death count of at least 14, 15,000. A large percentage of those being women and children. And so it's really a very difficult moment for people who study this region. I mean, I always tell my students that you may be depressed, but you'll never be bored. But this is just next level. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very difficult to process this. And there's also, in terms of trying to, because I'm contacted often by journalists and by others, and you know, really right now we're in the fog of war. And these events are just so fluid. From just yesterday telling someone, you know, that let's see if this temporary truce holds, to just go, you know, just hours later, the resumption of hostilities. Just things could just change on a dime. So it's very, very difficult to analyze the situation with so many moving parts, with so many different actors involved, like you said. The Israelis, obviously, Hamas and other militant groups, tensions increasing in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, a possible opening of a front in Lebanon with Hezbollah, missiles being launched from Yemen on the part of the Houthis, the deals and the negotiations involved by Israel, Hamas, the Qataris, who, as you said, are punching above their weight as a country, because they're one of the few, if only, countries that speak to groups like Hamas and have lines of communication. The Egyptians, who are on the border with the Rafah crossing, the Iranians and others. So there's just so many moving parts right now. But if we want to speak about Iran, that in itself is very interesting. right? And trying to, in terms of understanding the calculus there, right? And that this is not, at least in my view, a monolithic regime. Even if the hardliners or conservatives have largely consolidated and circled the wagons since the Raisi presidency in 2021, there's still heterogeneity, let's say, in preferences and perspectives among even within that faction, and then not to mention the others, and then Iranian society. And so I think, on the one hand, Iran, despite, whether it's played a direct role in this or not, I think that it's benefited in the sense that, as we've discussed, the attention has been distracted, or that the focus has now shifted towards Israel and Palestine, away from Iran, away from the nuclear program, away from the domestic protests and other adversity that the Iranian state and society are facing. The other thing that this did as well, again, regardless of the role that Iran played, is that it put the normalization within the framework of the Abraham Accords between Iran and Saudi Arabia on hold right now. So that was definitely a win, as the Iranians seeing this consolidation of an Arab-Israeli alliance against it in the region being undermined essentially right now, or at least being put on pause. But I think on the flip side, I think there's probably a lot of discussions and debates in Iran, as we've also discussed, in terms of the first, the first point being the concept of the principal agent dilemma, right? That I think we need to have a healthy debate about just how this relationship with Iran's partners and proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and others work, right? Because there tends to be an oversimplification that they just march to Tehran's orders. And I think the relationship is just much more complicated than that, where there's back and forth and a give and take. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if Tehran was either completely caught off guard by this attack or the extent of it, right? And I always question intentionality. I think that, there were plans for the attack that, we're now seeing the Israelis knew of a year ago and just dismissed due to arrogance. And this was a massive intelligence failure. So these actors, whether it's Iran as a state actor or Hamas and Hezbollah as quasi-state actors and others, they can have plans, but then when they unfold, they themselves could be surprised in terms of, just how little resistance there was on that southern border when they went in there. And just, I wouldn't be surprised either not to let Hamas off the hook or justify anything of what was done. But I wouldn't be surprised if they themselves lost control to more radical elements. Right. Because they themselves are not monolithic. They're also, operating alongside other groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others that are even more radical. So the operation may have gotten out of control. Before you know it, 1,200 people are killed. 200 plus hostages are taken. Now what, right? Now they've upped the ante significantly. And so I think for Iran, right, they understand the asset of these partners and proxies in their forward defense strategy against the United States and Israel, but there's also a liability to this, right? And so on the flip side, the Iranians have quickly seen an increased military presence by the United States with those carrier strike groups that were deployed. So now all of a sudden it's working counter to, I think, what Iran wants, which is a larger U.S. military presence in their backyard. And secondly, again, raising the risk. I think the Iranians have always tried to thread a needle where they want to, I would call it controlled chaos, where they want to inflict costs on the Americans and Israelis, but they don't want to ever go so far that there would be a direct conventional conflict where they're up against conventionally superior foes like Israel and the United States, particularly when you're talking about a nuclear weapons capacity in Israel. So, now all of a sudden, as we discussed, they're potentially being dragged in to a conflict by their own partners and proxies. The Houthis in Yemen, the Hezbollah in northern Israel, Hamas in terms of what they did on October 7th. So I think there's a lot of questions. And I think as a result of that, you're actually seeing, on the one hand, of course, you're seeing some bold rhetoric by Iranian elites, but you're seeing restraint operationally by Iran and by other partners and proxies beyond Hamas, including the Houthis and Hezbollah. And I think, Iran is kind of reevaluating and trying to figure out what it's going to do at this point in time, how to continue to thread that needle. And I think that's where we are. And not to mention the fact that they're also having conversations with countries like Saudi Arabia, which was facilitated by the Chinese brokered agreement in March. And they're not just talking recently about economic cooperation, but also security cooperation. And I think not just, the GCC and Saudi Arabia are worried about this turning into a regional conflict, but so are the Iranians, because I think at the end of the day, for the Iranians, the regime at least, it's all about controlled instability. And it's all about, at the end of the day, regime survival above all else, and not letting these events spiral out of control.
Right, 100%. And looking at this moment in time, it's hard to measure what Iran thinks it gained with so much uncontrollable events. I mean, once you really put boots on the ground and missiles start flying on any side, to be honest, just my observation of war, there are no innocent parties anymore. Everybody's guilty. Things could get out of hand. So much collateral damage. You can't control what soldiers do on the ground on either side. It doesn't matter what your ideology, what your higher moral ground is. It's all bad. It's all bad. And now, I think a political observer can look at Iran and say, yes, I understand why Iran supports all these other, groups, tribes around the region to sow instability and to really flex its power, saying we're a powerful group, just like the US is. But this is the unintended consequences of that purely financial support and maybe, political military support, but really no control. There's no guardrails to these things. And I think everything you said about Hamas getting carried away and going overboard and dragging Iran into the brink of war with Israel is something nobody wants. I know maybe there are right-wing groups in Israel that want a direct confrontation. Netanyahu has all but dragged the U.S. kicking and screaming, going to the UN with that red bomb in the line, really trying to fan the flames, challenging probably behind closed doors every U.S. president to find a way to go in. And even this recent report that comes in, to be honest, I don't want to be too much of a conspiracy theorist, but it seems like it's not just the egotistical or the way they dismissed this well thought out plan a year ago, the Israelis, but like all the conspiracies that we love in this region, they could have said, you know what, if something does happen, it gives us an excuse to go attack Hamas and get into Gaza uncontrolled, because we know by virtue of our American lobby, we know nobody will rein us in. There will not be any daylight between the U.S. and Israel, as you see, obviously. 14,000 dead, even if that number was 20, 30, unfortunately, tragically, you will not see the American president come out against the Israeli prime minister under any circumstances, no matter how many people died. I mean, that's a systematical kind of problem that I think people are observing, even though they've always known it, now in U.S. policy. I've called Israel the 51st state. That's not a criticism. That's just an economic reality. If you look at how much the U.S. gives to the other 50 states from a federal distribution, Israel is up there. So with that, I just feel like I just wanted to maybe narrow down our focus on, Iran is now what's happening in Iran and what the Iranian people want. I know they've called it revolution. You can call it evolution. They wanted their freedoms. They wanted their rights respected. Many women have just stopped wearing the hijab altogether. But now that the world is distracted, can you imagine we're actually don't even talk about Ukraine anymore. The active ongoing war in Ukraine is now secondary to what's happening in Gaza, and that makes Iran third, fourth on the list. So I'm just curious, going into an election year next year, I'm just curious, how will Biden look at this? How can Iran rise to the top as a discussion point, given the circumstances on the ground right now?
Well, I think that some government officials or politicians have tried to put Iran at the center. I mean, we saw this at different times of the conflict where I won't name names, but and even Israeli officials have done this, right? That it's at the end of the day, this is all about Iran. Iran is behind this. They should be the primary target here. And it's a distraction. It's a convenient distraction, right? To the tough questions that you've raised, which is, what are the implications here for the U.S.-Israel relationship? How does the U.S. stand by what's happening? As atrocious as what happened on October 7th to the Israelis, how does it just stand by? And so at times you see, again, like whether Iran wants it or not, that it's dragged to the center of this as a convenient, we know the Iranians support these groups, right? No one is disputing that. And as a matter of fact, that is part of their military doctrine. They have 4 pillars. They have cyber, they have missiles, they have drones, and the 4th one is partners and proxies. And so on the cheap, because the budgets are, at most several $100 million that we know of. I mean, they're not transparent, but it's a pittance of the GDP of Iran. When you're talking about $300-400 billion, but so on the cheap, they could financially and military support these groups. And I wouldn't necessarily argue they're doing it to propel themselves on equal footing with the United States or Israel, but to wage asymmetric warfare because they're not on equal footing conventionally, right? So these groups are a deterrence mechanism for Iran. And again, the goal is regime survival. And even if Netanyahu may want to strike or may want to outsource the United States to strike Iran, it has to think twice because of these groups, right? With all the rockets and missiles that they have, along with other capabilities that Iran has. So it's trying to create this asymmetric balance through these groups, right? Which is, we've seen, it has plausibly lost control of at times, to its detriment. So, but anyway, to like you said, Iran, at times has been buried under all of this. I think and you see analysts trying to say, well, let's not forget about what Iran is doing, aside from the partners and proxies. They just bought fighter jets from Russia, the Su-35s, which is now going to help modernize Iran's air force. They have not cut back on uranium enrichment levels, to 60+%. Advanced centrifuges, larger uranium stockpiles, dismissing IAEA inspectors. Some analysts are saying, we can't take the spotlight away from that. And not to mention what you said, we can't take the spotlight away from the activists in Iran who are sacrificing their lives for change, and who are paying the price for it. I mean, every now and then you still see these reports by human rights organizations about what these activists are suffering, including a Nobel Prize winner who's, sitting in prison, right? So in some ways, Iran being out of the spotlight benefits the regime, and in other ways, it has to fight to remain relevant on top of, Ukraine and these other issues. But again, we have to ask the hard questions as well about, where the U.S.-Israel relationship goes moving forward as well.
It's a tough situation. I mean, you mentioned, people in prison in Iran. I like any, I don't want any political prisoners in any prison. China, Iran, North Korea, some say in the U.S. even. But I hope the best cooler heads will prevail. That first, this conflict in Gaza will end. Then there will be a period of reconstruction to help the Palestinian people rebuild their lives. Although the generational impact that Israel has inflicted will not heal overnight. That is just a fact on the ground. So I think they've lost a lot, much more than the 1,200 people. They've clearly lost a war of public opinion, and the facts on the ground. And I hope the Palestinians find peace in their own state like they've long envisioned and they deserve, irrespective of Iran's role or not. But, to finish, we'll keep talking about Iran. Iran is our centerpiece. I hope those prisoners you mentioned are free. I think anytime a government arrests political prisoners, it looks weak. A strong government allows all voices to flourish around them. That's how you show strength. So I hope Iran comes to that realization. But until then, we'll keep talking about Iran until better times. Dr. Eric Lobb, thanks so much again for joining us from Florida. We hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks again for having me. Be well.